So, hello and welcome to another episode of Oh, What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me as ever is Jessica Meyer.
Hello.
And Chris Kempshaw.
Hello, everybody.
So today, we're once more discussing First World War movies. Last time we discussed what we rightly or wrongly called obscure films. This time we're going to be looking at, for convenience sake, we're labelling popular films. And the films we've singled out are All Quiet on the Western Front from 1930, A Grand Illusion, 1937, Paths of Glory, 1957, Oh, What a Lovely War, 1969, and Gallipoli, 1981. I wonder if we should start by, do we need to sort of wrangle what we're calling popular? Are these all popular films from their inception? Is that, have they always been with us, as it were?
Well, I think we also kind of need to caveat this, and I suspect that these films will not prove to be universally popular amongst us.
I think well-known might be better rather than popular.
Yeah. I mean, All Quiet on the Western Front was popular. Like the book, it was hugely, hugely widely watched. I think, both critically and in terms of mass viewing, I think there's no question. After that, I think, open to debate, perhaps.
I think Grande Illusion was a big hit in France. I don't know how much it exported beyond that.
It's certainly hugely popular among First World War studies academics, I can tell you that right now.
Yeah, I think we're like 95% of the audience now.
Well, possibly. I'm hoping that after today there'll be a bigger audience for it.
And Paths of Glory, when I was looking at it, amused me that it was up for a BAFTA against Bridge on the River Kwai and lost out to a Second World War film, which I thought was interesting. But it only just broke even at the time. I suspect the investors have made their money back in spades since Kubrick became somewhat of a celebrity director. And Gallipoli is a domestic success for Australia, but I don't know how well it exported at the time around the world.
I think it did quite well. It certainly made Peter Weir's name, didn't it? Or what's its relationship to Picnic at Hanging Rock?
Picnic at Hanging Rock predates it. And
so it's his follow-up. So he was well known at that point. So
and it's sort of very sort of similarly based very Australian feel to it, like Picnic at Hanging Rock. So should we start at the beginning with All Quiet on the Freston? So we start at the beginning with All Quiet on the Western Front.
Should we just mention the relative popularity of Oh, What a Lovely War in all of that?
Oh, I missed that. Yes. Oh, What a Lovely War. I forgot to look that up to see how much it grossed. Do we know how well it did at the time?
It did very well. Today I think it's quite popular as a teaching tool. Certainly I use it in my teaching, and I'm pretty sure that other academics do. What
I can say is the long trail, which is the seed that starts on in 1961, was unusually aired 3 times within a year, which is the nucleus of Oh, What a Lovely War, isn't it? And then that becomes the theatre play, and that becomes the film. So there's certainly some threads in it that were popular as far back as 61. It comes out in 69, doesn't it? Written by Len Deaton of spy thriller renown.
Which is a bit of a shift.
Sorry, I've just pulled up that it was ranked 16th in the UK box office in 1969.
What was number 1? So what?
Lord, now you're asking.
Well, I was going to say, can we gauge what's number 1? It's probably something like 69 Bond.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
Fair enough. At least it's missing out to another, a real classic,
which was only released in October.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So shall we start with All Quiet on the Western Front? Do we need to start in 1930?
Yeah, why not?
It's an interesting film because it's an American. I couldn't work out. I was quite surprised. It's an American take on a German book, isn't it? And I was quite surprised that the Americans hadn't transposed it into an American experience, rewritten it.
The acting was very American, though.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I found it slightly jarring when it started, the fact that they've all got very heavy American accents. I don't know if... my American geography of American accents is is poor, but they all seem quite. There was one of them was quite a sort of seemed to me to be sort of a New York kind of accent, and then there weren't that kind of generic American accents. So, am I right there, Jessica? All right.
There's sort of an early 20th century American version of RP, if you will. That if you watch enough early 20th century films up to about the 1950s, there is this particularly male accent that comes across over and over and over again. My instinctive reaction to it was, oh my God, it's an American high school football film from the mid-century. And that, I think, was because of the accent. So yeah, I actually couldn't watch more than about an hour of it this time around, partly because of, too much family life going on in the middle of a pandemic, but also I just found it so jarring. I couldn't sort of square my understanding of the book with the representation on the screen. I was really struggling with that.
It's a surprisingly, in its own way, graphic film for 1930. I'm thinking about the two hands left hanging onto the barbed wire during the French attack, and I don't know what the film certification process is in Hollywood in the 1930s, but that's a level of kind of body horror gore that I wasn't immediately expecting, despite the fact that I, having watched it then afterwards, going, oh yeah, I'd forgotten that bit was in there. But at the same time, I found that quite weird that the elements of those battle scenes were not as low budget or sanitized as might have been expected for the 1930s.
The battle scenes are remarkable. There's a fantastic part where the machine guns rattling away and the German trenches and the French are all running up, and I've never seen it done quite like that before. There's a tracking shot as the French run up, and they're all sort of falling down as they're being shot. But the tracking shot it's long. It goes on for quite a long way, so you really do get the idea of waves of men being sort of mowed down. It's very effective.
Just on the explicitness of it, it is pre-Hays Code. Now, my knowledge of the Hays Code is what can be shown in terms of sort of social morality, sexual morality, drug taking, and the like. I don't know if it applied to violence and graphic violence in quite the same way, or the results of violence. But it is pre-Hays Code, because that's 1934.
Does it differ? I've never read the book. Does it differ a lot from the book?
Well, the bits I watch are remarkably loyal to the book. It does the order differently. So it starts in the classroom, which doesn't come in the book until later. But narratively, yeah, it's actually remarkably loyal to the book.
Because something that struck me was that the main protagonist is Paul. He's a hero not for doing anything heroic, but enduring, which struck me as quite un-Hollywood way of taking a take on the hero.
Yeah, I mean, it only comes out, a year after the book comes out, because the book's first serialized in Germany at the end of 1928, and then it's published all over the world in the spring of 1929, and it becomes a massive, massive bestseller almost immediately. So if the film comes out in 1930, that's a really, really fast turnaround. So I'm just not sure there's certainly not time to bring in any new writers other than to translate it and turn it into a script.
From a weird technical point of view, it's a beautiful film. That kind of, what I think of, and to an extent, I kind of start to think of Citizen Kane, but Citizen Kane is like a decade afterwards of that scene in the classroom where the professor's in focus, the students in the front row are in focus, and you can see out the window and the soldiers behind them are marching in focus. The technological kind of the construction, the cinematography of it is gorgeous at times. There's such a depth of vision and a feel that gives you the impression of being in the middle of something huge repeatedly. So even bits and pieces when they're arriving in the trenches, or not in the trenches, when they arrive on trains, and the trains are in the foreground, and they've got the whole road leading up behind them in the background, and it's a huge long. I mean, it's probably a matte painting, but all of it is crisply in focus, and I spent a lot of time kind of admiring the cinematography of it rather than the First World War nature of it.
So why do you think some of that? Why do you think some of that other stuff sort of you missed it out? You let that wash over you. Were you not trope ticking on a list? I mean, is it writing tropes that we see further on, or is it inventing them? I should say.
Well, no, I was just going to say back to that point about heroism is endurance rather than action. And I think this is something, I think what sets the films we're discussing today slightly apart from, or at least most of them, slightly apart from the ones that we discussed last month is the extent to which that idea of futile sacrifice is much more explicit in these films. And to that extent, yes, the novel as well as the film is writing that narrative, is one of the originators of that narrative. In terms of specifically cinematic tropes, I suspect we probably should have asked a proper film historian on to talk about that.
It shows us trenches, which I don't think we had in our last films, did we? Quite. I think all of these show trench life. Actually, Grand Illusion doesn't, because it doesn't actually show the war, but the others do depict trench life, and I wondered if that very fact that it depicts trench life actually has kept them more current, because when we want to watch a First World War film, we want to see a trench. Yeah,
we want that visual recognition of this is what makes a First World War film, because look, there's a trench.
Or No Man's Land.
Or No Man's Land.
When we come to Paths of Glory.
Well, you get that kind of in all quite in the Western Front, where they're sweeping backwards and forwards. I mean, it's interesting. They show the battles going back. They do actually show movement as the Germans pull out of the trench, and then they counterattack and they take over the trench. So you do actually get sort of some sort of scope and scale of the battlefield.
I have a weird thing about battles and movement in war films. And generally, it works out fine in the sense that if you turn your television screen into a compass, so the top's the north, the right-hand side is the east, bottom's the south, left-hand side is the west. Ordinarily, in battle scenes, people move from left to right. Now, that's fine for Allied soldiers, because we envisage them moving from west to east. And you get exactly that in All Quiet on the Western Front. The French come from the left, they attack to the right, the Germans pull back to the right and then counterattack back to the left. And you also get it in Gallipoli, where the Australians attack from left to right. Now, as an aside thing, I can't remember where it was, but someone was talking about children's drawings, German children's drawings in school of the First World War, during the First World War, and they draw all of their soldiers attacking from left to right on the page, generally attacking the French. So I think there's like an element of it's just how you draw. Progress of moving forward goes from left to right.
I wonder if countries where you read right to left do it the other way.
I would be really interested in that. But Paths of Glory does it the wrong way round. In Paths of Glory, the French attack from right to left. They're going in the wrong direction. Yeah. And I don't know why I find it annoying or so jarring, but they're attacking in the wrong direction.
But isn't that one of the critiques that's made of the Battle of the Somme, the wartime quote-unquote documentary, that everything is the British attacking left to right, even when geographically that wasn't the case in various parts of the Somme.
Yeah. There's a bit, so you've got the staged footage in the documentary of them all going over the top and dying, but then you've got a shot at great distance of some British soldiers on a hill, and they come from right to left. They come from right to left, and then they move down, and then there's an explosion and a load of them fall down on the floor and die. So that's presumably been filmed looking down the line or in that direction, but that's a very weird kind of cinematic jar.
Yeah, but is it John Ford in Stagecoach or something, which gets it famously all wrong, and he has his chase running left to right and right to left, and it crossing the line. It's an easy mistake to make. there's a making of documentary of the Great War BBC documentary, and one of the editors said that one of the hardest things they had was sorting out footage. So they had cabinets with, this is the Germans that we can use because they're facing the right way, and here's the shelf with the British facing it, and they had it all mapped out. So there's whole rafts of stuff that they couldn't use because it was filmed the wrong way around, and they were trying to ram it home to the viewer that the Germans were on this side and they're on that side. And they were really quite aware that they couldn't cross the line to confuse people.
Comes continuity masterclass.
Yeah. Because I think that took them a year or two to put together.
Kubrick clearly hadn't taken that masterclass in that case.
Yeah, well, maybe I don't know. Maybe in his head he thought they were in a salient or something, and it was all back to front.
I can definitely read too much into it, but I don't also think it's out of the realms of possibility that he's trying to refer to it as a backwards war, in a kind of this is ridiculous, this is daft, and here's a little visual clue in that the whole thing is backwards. Now, I'm probably reading too much into that, but it just seems like a very odd framing of it, that the French were taking, but how we envisage the movement forwards, they're going in the wrong direction.
But is it also something to do with the isolation? Because there is no depiction of enemies in it, is there? It's the one that makes absolutely explicit that the enemy is within, that the enemy is, the upper ranks, and this comes up in other films, but it's right. Is this the point where I say how little I liked this film?
I think the time might have come. Bearing in mind that almost regardless of what you're going to say, I'm still going to love it to bits.
That's fine. It doesn't help that I can't stand Kubrick, so we've got that problem to begin with. Yeah, I found it claustrophobic, which I think was the intent, and highly pretentious. But that's my loathing of Kubrick. So there we go.
I mean, it is a claustrophobic. It's a very dark film, as in the lighting of it. Outside of the courtroom scene and maybe the meeting with the general at the end, I think it's large parts of the film take place in very, very darkened environments, and it is very claustrophobic.
Yeah. Well, there's the execution scene, which is outside, but you've just come straight from the prison, and all those scenes in the prison, and then all the scenes at headquarters, and the raid at night.
There's also the bit at the very, very early on where the general gets upset because he says there's no such thing as shell shock and slaps a man, which, because obviously he's right, because it's PTSD now, as we all know. But this is a podcast, you can't see the roll of her eyes that Jessica just gave. Also, if the French had been really committed to that attack, they would have just all sheltered behind Kirk Douglas's chiselled jaw, and they'd have been in Berlin by the end of the week during the offensive, because never has a man looked more ridiculously Hollywood masculine than Kirk Douglas as Colonel Dax. Bearing in mind that he also plays Spartacus, which is like an uber level of masculinity.
And then up against all the mustachioed French generals who are Hollywood French.
Yes. And can't conceive of a man doing something for any reason apart from wanting to get promoted. Which is a very interesting little aspect of it.
That, and the fact that the only woman in it is no role at all, and the misogyny of that final scene just absolutely outraged me.
It's Kubrick's wife.
That doesn't make it any better.
I didn't know that.
What I found interesting about that last scene, she sings away in German, and all the French sing along. And I think comes up a few times. It's kind of a pan-European sentiment in some of these films that sort of bubbles away in the background. It's certainly in Grande Illusion, isn't it? Where we're all, this idea that Europe is sort of a big melting pot of people, and the borders are something that are imposed upon by people above us.
But the difference between Paths of Glory, that final scene in Paths of Glory, and the end segment of La Grande Illusion, where they're in the German farmhouse with Colette is the actress, I don't know, can't remember the name of her character, is that she's given a backstory and a motivation and agency. Her man went away to war, and her brothers, and didn't come back. and she's on her own, and she's looking to a man for support, but there is an emotional and economic reason for her actions that aren't just about her being some figurehead of captured womanhood who's supposed to represent the equality between the French and the Germans. It's more complex and interesting than that. Yes, there's absolutely the pan-Europeanist. I mean, that's Renoir's point, isn't it? That there's more that the French and the Germans have in common than that divides them. And the divisions are more along the lines of rank and class than they are along the lines of nationality.
The aristocratic conversations in the Grande Illusion are... I mean, it's not subtle, but it's great.
What's the cafe called? They're all. Then there's a joke of it later on. It's good that they eat at in Paris. That keeps coming up.
Oh,
Maxims. And then they can make a joke of it later on about it obviously being the Maxim gun. I know a girl called Fifi. Did you used to eat at Maxim's?
One of the things I liked, or kind of I liked, but it came like increasingly kind of like, oh yeah, I can see, of watching the Grande Illusion is what I kind of refer to in my head as the Bond film title moment, where the name of the film comes up as a spoken word of dialogue or something like that. So, you'll be watching, I don't know, like a Bond film, and they'll go, he said the line that's actually the name of the film. I see what they're doing there. The words illusion come up with increasing frequency during La Grande Illusion, and by the end of it, it's like, no, honestly, don't worry, I got it. I'm with you. It's fine.
It's not subtle.
No.
From the film I enjoyed least this month to the film I enjoyed most, I adore The Grande Illusion. There's so much of it that just makes me deeply happy as a historian and as a film viewer.
It's the female characters singing "It's a Long Way to Tipperary."
Do you want to explain the female characters singing "It's a Long Way to Tipperary"?
Well, they're British prisoners of war, aren't they?
This is a question I wanted to get your guys' opinions on. I couldn't quite work out if they were British, or if they're making fun of the British, because all the characters, whatever their nationality, switch between French and English and German, sometimes seemingly a little bit at random, particularly in the conversations between the aristocrats. And when the French prisoners are moved out of that prison, it's British prisoners who are moved in, and they don't speak French because he can't tell them about he tries to tell them about the tunnel, and he keeps going, I don't understand, I don't speak French, I don't speak French, in ever louder tones. That's a moment where they're clearly just making fun of the British. And unlike the later prison, where it's very clear that there are other prisoners who are Russians and who are portrayed as specifically Russians, that little group of men singing Tipperary, it isn't obvious that they're British, because the second time they do it, when they do it as a drag review, and then the news comes through, which battle is it? Is Douaumont?
It's Douaumont.
Yeah. About...
We start singing La Marseillaise.
And we see straight into what is going to get picked up by Casablanca in a couple of years. And everybody stands up and starts singing La Marseillaise. So is that them being French mocking the British by doing Tipperary in drag? Is that them being British siding, with enough Europeanness in their alliance to be able to sing La Marseillaise at the drop of a hat? I'm not sure. What do you guys think?
I think that they're French doing Tipperary, but there are British soldiers in the camp, because when they arrive, one of the British soldiers has his watch taken and he calls him a beastly fellow, or or something along those lines. So there are British soldiers there that you see very, very briefly, but I don't think those are British soldiers singing Tipperary. I think they're French and they're taking the mickey out of the British. And in a very, very kind of heavily stylized way, partly because they all then start singing the Marseillaise, and it might just be my kind of topic and like that. British soldiers do sing the Marseillaise at times, but I'm not convinced that many of them know the words. And I think it's overwhelmingly a French audience and a French cast and a couple of Germans there. There aren't any British in the audience. I think they're French and they're pretending to be British because they think it's funny and they're doing it in drag. And to be fair, they're not wrong.
So I just read them as all being British for the simple reason, and I watched it back about an hour ago, and they all have very good British accents because I did wonder that, and I think they're all British for the simple reason that British prisoners of war get dressed up in drag, or they just like doing it, like 8.5 Octo, and they spend half the time in drag, and you get all these Second World War movies where at the drop of the hat the British are wrestling themselves into drag.
But I think the fact that the British do like getting dressed up in drag is why the French are mocking them by getting dressed up in drag and singing Tipperary. I think I'm with Chris on this in my reading of it. Although it's worth pointing out that there is also a tradition of German drag, which Jason Krauthammel's written about. So I think this is a European-wide form of performance. But if they are the French mocking the British, it's interesting that they choose a song about Ireland. I think the point that Emma makes in her book on music in the First World War is that Tipperary is popular at the very beginning of the war, and it's one of those songs that the British establishment wants to be popular and tries to encourage. But actually, the soldiers themselves prefer more sentimental songs, things like The Long, Long Trail or, the vulgarities of Mademoiselle from Armentières. So it sort of falls out of popularity by early 1915, I think is an argument that she makes. So the fact that it's picked up as this typically British song is quite interesting. As I say, particularly because it's referencing Ireland after.
I think it's written in 1912, and it's about an Irish navvy wanting to go home.
Well, isn't it picking up on the number of Irishmen in the British regular army? The ranks of the British regular army, because it's a steady job. The Irish regular is certainly during the war itself a sort of stock cliche character, and Sapper, Herman Cyril McNeill, in his war stories, has the first collection he brings out is called Sergeant Michael Cassidy, RN, or RE rather, which has this Royal Engineers sergeant who is an old Irish soldier who tells these stories that are designed to encourage men to enlist. They're pretty blatant recruitment propaganda, and he is such a appalling stereotype, English stereotype of the Irish, but it was a popular series of short stories published in the Daily Mail during the war itself. So this would have been a familiar figure at the time.
There's also an element. I mean, again, I'm kind of reading far too much into the chronology, but given that in the background battles over Douaumont are taking place, so it's 1916. Which is also the year of the Easter Rising. So there's a decent chance that the Easter Rising has happened by the time they're singing this song. You can read far too much into it. It's just as conceivable that they picked a well-known British First World War song for it. But it's an interesting extra kind of in-universe element.
I found it fascinating. That was... Yeah, I did say when we were discussing what we were going to discuss today that we had to talk about Tipperary at some point, and the canning soldiers in drag.
Yeah.
I think because then you're bringing in stock tropes of fin de siècle Paris.
The actor who plays, ironically, Marshal, which is the highest rank you can get in the French army, and he's the lower class. The actor who played him used to have work at the Moulin Rouge as well in the early 20th century, or I can't remember if it was before or after the war. It was probably, he was born at the end of the war, or just before the war, so it was in kind of like the 1920s and 1930s. So he would have been fairly familiar with can tropes, you'd imagine. and presumably many other things.
They do have a lot of fun with national stereotypes in that film. They really do.
Well, it's interesting because it's presumably, well, it's not, it is made to the backdrop, presumably, in people's minds of the rise of Nazi Germany next door. So when you're putting in the Germans and German stereotypes, that presumably that's somewhere to be kept in mind.
Yeah, it's 37, isn't it? Can I go on to Lucian? And, there is ongoing discussions in that film about whether or not the word of someone called Rosenthal is worth as much as the word as somebody like us. And, constant reference to, he was born in Jerusalem, when actually he's Austrian and nationalised French or something along those lines. There's
an element to which, the people who have those conversations either die or the German officer who is a cyborg, essentially, when he describes he's
reached his Darth Vader form by about 2/3 of the way through the film.
Is he fully human anymore? Has he actually survived the war as a human being?
Well, amusingly, he's another player on the Richthofen, isn't he? He's got I can't remember what his name is, but it sounds sort of similar. Everyone's obsessed with Richthofen flyers.
But ever so slightly changed for copyright purposes, presumably.
Von Rauffenstein.
Yes.
Of course, played by Erich von Stroheim, which is...
Who apparently, when I was reading it, speaks, despite being from Vienna, speaks basically no German and really struggled with the German in the script.
Is there any reason why they suddenly start speaking English that we know?
Well, particularly at the point when he's going to shoot the upper class French officer, whose name I can't remember, Boulanger. He's up there and it's a high moment of drama, and you know what? To convey exactly what I want you to do, I'm going to switch to a third language at this point.
My assumption is, though, that's to create a barrier of a class barrier, is that they can speak English and they can sort of switch into it, and because it's the English being the lingua franca.
So it's one thing to do it to impress, possibly, to keep what they're saying private from the soldiers who are around them in that scene. But they do it again. They've done it before in that when they're taking tea together, when they're very specifically alone and being, in their elite relationship there.
I hate myself in advance for this. There's an alternative reading, which is the allo reading, in which they are actually speaking French or German, but they've switched to English to make it easier for the audience to concentrate on what's going on.
But the audience will be French, so it may be even more confusing.
Oh, that's true. Oh, God. Yeah, for some reason, the allo theory doesn't check out at all.
Because it did occur to me, for a French audience, all right, some of them probably can speak German and French, but English might be the one language too far for a naturalised French audience.
Well, I suppose this is when we say to our listeners, if anybody knows why they suddenly start speaking in English randomly, please let us know.
But it is that the way they do click through the languages does make it, strangely sort of pan-European in that respect.
Well, it is. I think you're absolutely spot on that it is the great European unification, for what a better word, film that is at its core. Talking about sort of overt and heavy symbolism, the crossing of the border in the final scene that's it. It's the wiping out of European borders. Is the driving message of the film. That is the greatest illusion of all, that this continent can sensibly have borders without killing each other over them.
Shall we skip forward 20 years? We'll kind of skip forward. We've already sort of touched upon Paths of Glory, but we've got this sort of Paths of Glory and I was going to say Lawrence of Arabia. We're not looking at Lawrence of Arabia. Well, I made a note that there's 3 British films are made in the 60s about the First World War. It's Lawrence of Arabia, King and Country, which I've not seen, and Oh, What a Lovely War. But anyway, what I meant was Oh, What a Lovely War. So we've got 2 films from what is, I guess, is classically this idea of the war being reassessed from this period, from the 60s, sort of somewhere around onwards. I mean, it's interesting that what amused me thinking along those lines is, when people talk about the 60s, this 60s reassessment of the Great War, Paths of Glory is 57, so can it be counted as that part of the reassessment? It falls out of a strict bracketing of this kind of thing.
Well, we can link it to La Grande Illusion via music, can't we? Do one of you point out that all but one of these films have Tipperary in them at some point?
Yeah, yes, Gallipoli does. Yes.
Does it?
Paths of Glory that doesn't.
Does All Quiet? Did I miss that?
All Quiet. No, I can't remember.
It's Paths of Glory that doesn't, isn't it?
Three of the five do it anyway. So
yeah. And it's used for used for recruiting. It's playing the band are playing it for recruiting in Gallipoli.
But yeah, there's a lot more than Tipperary when it comes to music in Over the Lovely War.
See, I wondered if all these films are actually about class, and it comes out in Oh What a Lovely War, because Charles. Oh, I can't believe I forgot. I've been listening to it all day. Charles Long Trail. Charles Chilton. So Charles Chilton comes up with this documentary. It's a long trail in '62. He's a light entertainer producer for the BBC, and he's been collecting music. And so he gets the music together from what he considers to be from the First World War, and then if you listen to it, he adds links. He adds links to get you from one tune to the other. And I thought the links were in that way that he'll find a hook in a song and try and get that in the link to get you to the next song, rather than it be a strict form of history, if that makes sense. So It's a Long Trail is a very light entertainment piece. So the Chilton documentary airs 3 times in the first year, and then it's picked up to become Oh What a Lovely War. Now, but Chilton's, what he's picking out is music, but he also picks out not necessarily the kind of tropes songs. His point is, here's the songs that people sang, not necessarily the ones that Ivor Novello wrote, though he does have Keep the Home Fires Burning in. And that is then transcoded into the film, which then becomes, when you add the imagery, very much more of a sort of a lower classes parody of the war. I think it gets politicised along the way to make it into a very class-orientated film, I think is what I was trying to say.
Well, I think some of that happens when it's turned into a play by Jane Littlewood, because the theatre workshop in Stratford, because they do the play before Attenborough picks it up as a film. Although it's Attenborough who turns it in, who uses the end of Pierrot show as the sort of unifying theme, which is really interesting because it really draws out the music hall elements of the music, but also of the recruiting process. I mean, there is the recruiting scene, which is weirdly middle class, actually, rather than working class. I was thinking of all the histories of 19th century music hall as a much more working class space. But I think that's the point. The play is the point where the class politics starts again, because that was always so explicitly part of what Littlewood was trying to do in Stratford.
It's the imagery that gets added to the film as well. You know, you get the whole Chateau Generals when they're all at dances. Mind you, this comes out of Paths of Glory in spades, doesn't it, when you're talking about class? I mean, you couldn't get a bigger divide.
But it's not quite as, hard cut upper and lower class, because you have the scene where they're going through the turnstile and they're all giving their names and they're all Smith. And there's a definite variation across the working and middle classes there, up to quite a professional upper middle class accent and turn of phrase. So the message seems to be, there is this political and military elite back home, but those who have gone through Kitchener's recruitment turnstile to participate in the war are actually perhaps more, it's not just the oppressed working classes, it's a bit more varied than that.
Yeah, the class dynamic focuses in very much on that the upper class, whereas everybody else is then being kind of inflicted to varying degrees below them. And then kind of with the zoom in on figures like Haig.
Who gets accused of not being the right, of being, I can't remember the phrase, industrial class or something, when someone, hey, you can't get away with whiskey. Oh. He's not quite the right upper class.
And they're not entirely kind to all the working classes, because there's the scene with the female munitions workers, and particularly their support of the war against, first their support of the war against the suffragette pacifists, which is ahistorical given the Pankhurst support of the war in 1914. I mean, that's to generalize about women who supported suffrage movements. Some were profoundly war resistant and profoundly pacifist. There's no question. But then there's the later one where the women are being actually quite rude about the munitions worker who's lost someone when they're looking at the lists of casualties. Again, I found it quite misogynistic, the portrayal of those women as ignorant and warmongering.
Well, they could earn £3 an hour, £3 a day, or something in overtime. I
mean, it does reflect attitudes, because that's what Deborah Tom has written about in Nice Girls and Rude Girls. The relative wealth of female munitions workers and the sort of establishment antipathy towards that, and the way they were portrayed as improper because they had economic freedom in a way they hadn't before.
They do try to connect their work. I'm not quite sure how well it worked though. I can't remember quite what they said. It's like there's about an explosion or something and someone being injured. It's almost they're trying to link that back in with the suffering of the the bombs and the artillery of the front.
It's not quite as simplistic as I think some descriptions of the film would have you believe. And partly that's because it's drawing on the actual, they say at the beginning that a lot of the material attributed to the named figures, and indeed to some of the unnamed figures, is actually drawn from the archive. And the nurse's letter, I meant to check if that's Catherine Luard. I'm not sure who it is, but it's definitely in one of the published nurses' memoirs that I've read. I just can't remember exactly which one. Elements of it are very much based in the archival record.
Should we get to Gallipoli?
Which, for reasons that I have no doubt we'll discuss, might be I understand why it's called Gallipoli. You could have quite easily have called that film Anzac and it would be much less of a misnomer.
Other than there's no New Zealanders in it.
Well, yeah, that's true, but they're busy fighting Sauron and his orc army at the moment, I think.
There is very briefly, there's sort of one moment of New Zealand, isn't there?
Well, Anzac has kind of been hijacked by the Australians.
Yes.
Yes.
Gallipoli was the film that I looked forward to watching most and the one I probably enjoyed least.
Why did you enjoy it least?
It waffled on a lot, and Vangelis. It's not. Is it? It's not Vangelis. It's.
I think it is. I think it is Vangelis. Yeah,
it's Vangelis. Yes, it is. It's actually. I find it really jarring. The soundtrack.
Yes,
it's very of its time. Is that soundtrack?
Frankly, they should have used some of those lasers fighting the Ottomans, because that would have improved their war efforts any number of times. That lovely 80s electro music at various moments of tension. It's like, oh, fantastic, it's Gallipoli, but it's also Tron.
And I might be wrong. I'm led to believe there's an upper-class Australian accent, so which sounds British. And to be honest, I couldn't quite put my pin in what was the upper-class Australian accent and what was the British accent, but it is like watching most American American crime dramas. Spot the eel person; they've got an English accent.
There aren't actually any English in it. It is just upper class Australians. I realised I'm with you. The last time I saw it, I was thinking that the colonel who insists on continuing with the advance is English. It's not. It's just the report of the English drinking tea at Silver Bay. That's the only moment that the English appears. They're never actually represented on screen.
And I mean, that guy who refers to, we have to attack because the British are landing at Suvla. It's the British are someone else, and you have to do this. But the implication is that we're not British. But listen to my incredible accent. and draw your own conclusions.
Well, there's this, something else I noted was this lack of saluting and sort of deference to those in charge, because they're Australians, and you've got this idea of independent thinking kind of thing. That I'm sure you wouldn't get in a British film, or they'd be snappily jumping to salute. That's
quite American as well in its own way. That idea of we don't care about the things that don't matter, but we're good soldiers because of it. That kind of rough and ready, not interested in restrictive structures and hierarchy, but show us the enemy and we'll go get them type thing is a Australian American shared kind of idea.
I'm sorry, I'm wrong, because that reminds me, there are the two British officers who they failed to see
on the mules in Egypt.
Yeah, in Egypt, in Cairo.
And somehow the Australians managed to magic up monocles to chase after them on the donkeys.
And walking sticks.
and having been completely unable to ride a horse, the Mel Gibson character is then perfectly able to ride a mule, which I believe is much more difficult, in fact.
I was going to say it's interesting because it's the Far East, the Middle East. But I guess if you're Australian, it's interesting the Australians put the pin in the Gallipoli, and they could just as well have put it in the Western Front, but you have this idea from the sort of 70s of nation building built around being Anzac Cove, haven't you?
It precedes that. I mean, it derives from the war, and these are all the histories of Australia in the war that sort of deconstruct Charles Bean's hagiography. God, I'm forgetting my publication dates. I've just been reading Carolyn Holbrook's Anzac, the Unauthorized Biography, and she notes, which I think most historians of the Australian War experience do, that the idea of Gallipoli as foundational emerges, from 1916 onwards, even as the sacrifices of the Western Front are happening. Yeah, I think it's actually very deep-rooted in the Australian mythology of the war, even before the 1970s.
When I was watching Gallipoli, because it was the first one that I watched, so I'd start with this one and then do the others. I remember watching it going, and then after I'd watched all of them going, right, Jessica is going to love Le Grand Illusion. I'm pretty sure we've spoken about it before. But I think Gallipoli probably has more interesting tick boxes for Jessica than any of the other films. Because there's loads of military masculinity stuff. There's loads of kind of elements of medical stuff, particularly the conversation about... okay, you're going to go out and meet some young ladies and you're probably going to have sex with them. So here's a chalk drawing of the male reproductive organ. And loads of those, they cover, admittedly, for a film called Gallipoli, which is an hour and 55 minutes long, they spend no more than half an hour at Gallipoli. They could have quite easily have called it Egypt, and have spent a comparable amount of time there. But they cover a lot of stuff in it.
The VD lecture is interesting because that is actually historically accurate in a sense. The Australians were very good at preventing and treating VD, to the extent that there is an entire chapter in Alexia Moncrief's new book on the Australian Army Medical Services, specifically on VD, because there's just so much information on it. And apparently, and I have not read enough Australian First World War memoirs specifically, but one of the difficulties that Australian ex-servicemen had in publishing memoirs was that too many of them wanted to talk about drinking and sex and gambling, and the establishment was going, no, we need sort of heroic soldiers to uphold the myth of Gallipoli. Again, I'm calling very much on Carolyn's book here, because this is all the sort of stuff she talks about in terms of the development of the myth. But yeah, apparently Australians like to write about the earthier aspects of soldiers' lives. So it becomes part of the myth in a way that it doesn't, certainly in Britain, and feeds into that sense of Australians as being, different and less respectful and less, sort of hidebound than the British, which is part of the point of the myth making. To, after Federation, which happens in 1901, this trying to find an identity that isn't just about their relationship to the mother country. or at least for the white settler population.
One of the other parts that appears in Gallipoli, and almost in some form in every other film, not quite to the same extent in Paths of Glory, is some form of conversation that indicates that the reason why the war has started is just stupid. So they have a conversation over at various points about, why Australia's going to war, because Germany's done this thing. It's definitely their fault, but we're not entirely sure, and we've got to fight them there so we don't have to fight them here, and that's why we're going to Turkey. In a very weird thing, and they have a different conversation along the same lines with the guy who has the camel when they're crossing the lake. And he basically, if we don't fight them here, they'll come and take this, and he's like, well, they're welcome to it. And then when they're training for their battle in the desert, and you've got some of them you've got the light horse lying down on the dunes shooting at them, and their the infantry firing moving when they're coming towards you, and it's all fake. And it just descends into like a weird kind of pushing, shoving contest, which does a nice job of kind of, you're never going to get to this point. You're never actually going to get to the point where you're all wrestling each other in the sand. But then it's okay, all of you who are wounded, lie down, and those of you who are still alive, carry them to the aid station, and everybody lies down, and you've got an officer wandering around between them. Oh, come on now, you can't all be dead. This kind of slightly farcical introduction to what will become appears at various points in virtually all of the films. This kind of slightly kind of farce, dark humour element of the war is stupid. The preparations you're having for the battles is quite stupid, and there's worse to come. Element appears. It's definitely in La Grande Illusion. It's definitely in Gallipoli. It's definitely there's conversations in All Quiet on the Western Front when they're conversing about why the war's happening, and there's like, well, I'm not offended in the least, so I'll just go home then, shall I? About the Kaiser.
Is that why we remember these films? Is that why these films are we were called popular, because they have this theme that we now think as the war kind of thing? You have to have it because that's what the war is. It's doesn't make sense. It's crazy.
I think it is. It's futile, and the enemy isn't the man in the trench opposite who might be singing Silent Night, albeit in another language. The enemy is the colonel on the telephone behind the line who's ordering you to advance when it's complete nonsense to do so. And that is the message across all of these films, right? With La Grande Illusion, as you say, perhaps a little bit less so, but then it, how many times do we need to be told that society is an illusion and the war is an illusion?
And it's filmed over about a 40-year spread. I mean, obviously, the what happens with the portrayal of the war in the interwar years through novels and the like takes on a change and a life on its own. But the idea of, the war gets entirely reconsidered in the 1960s, well, we've got 5 films that cover 40 years, and there is definite threads that run right through all of them.
And 3 continents, right?
Yeah.
4 nations, 3 continents.
So basically, if you need to make a First World War film, that's one of the boxes you've got to tick to have success.
Well, I mean, if we were to now to lead into a future episode about 1917 or similar, that would be therein lies the obvious comparison of how much does 1917 refer to or borrow or reuse existing tropes from the earth.
One last question I had written down was to consider was, how many tropes do we see in All Quiet in the Sorry, if you think of All Quiet on the Western Front being at the start of the war film sort of genre in 1930, or it's the earliest one we've got, how many of those can we tick off by the time we get to Gallipoli that have been carried through? Possibly not in the other films that we looked at. Trenches. The other films weren't quite so big on trenches. It's very prominent as the idea of the big push in all these films. Oh, it's the big push. What else did I note? Trench existence, the craziness of trench existence. There's just that it's just mad. Shaking the dead man's hand that's sticking out at the side of the trench. It's an altered reality. It's a different state that you're in that trench. These are all there, in that 1930 film that then come with us all the way through. as I say, weren't necessarily, I don't think, in those other films, the more obscure films, which could be why they're more obscure. They don't tick those boxes that we need to have, the flags, the markers that we need to have.
There was something else, and admittedly, because I couldn't track down my DVD copy of Oh, What a Lovely War, so I'm kind of going off of memories of having watched it previously. And this is I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. The use of people who look ordinary, by which I mean not Hollywood handsome. If we take maybe Mel Gibson and Kirk Douglas and maybe Paul in All Quiet on the Western Front, a lot of the actors and the characters are not overtly handsome men in a kind of a film star element. They all look very ordinary in their appearance. And if you think of is it Cat in All Quiet on the Western Front, is a old, heavy, grizzled guy, but there's like a weight and nobility in his grizzleness because he knows how the war really is, and that's how he's survived for so long.
I wondered if he's the start of the idea of the visual trope for what the old hand sergeant kind of NCO needs to look like, because he couldn't look any more grizzled with his smashed-in face, and he's sort of he has a slight speech impediment because clearly his nose has been very badly broken at some point.
You see, the problem I have with that theory is that's predicated on Mel Gibson being the major star of Gallipoli, which...
Yes,
he is. But he's one of two, right? And...
yeah.
Mark Lee, who plays Archie Hamilton, is much more conventionally a Hollywood pretty boy, for want of a better word. And at the time that this is made, there's no reason why he shouldn't go on to be the major Hollywood star.
Yeah. Has Mel Gibson done Mad Max before or after? Is he up and coming, or is he emerging?
I think he'd done it before.
So Mark Lee at that point had made his film debut after a career as a model and a coffeehouse singer.
Well, Mad Max is 1979.
Which also means I need to change my previous statement. Actually, that there were films over a 50-year spread that have, rather than a 40-year spread that have recognisable elements. With Archie at the beginning, it was just like a weird moment where, because he was, preparing for his run, and he's got this old granddad who's like, what are your legs? They're springs. How fast can you run? Faster than a leopard. What are you going to do? Run faster than a leopard? It did sound very much like he was going to make him get chased by a leopard at the very beginning of the film. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so part of my point about bringing up the objection, based on Mark Lee's looks, is I've just been reading an article on Gallipoli from which was published in 1995 in a collection on gender and the war. Which is essentially a psychosexual analysis of the film, whose central argument is that Archie Hamilton, as the young, good-looking outback figure, has to be killed in order for the slightly older, more mature, modern urban figure of Mel Gibson's character, whose name is escaping me, to survive, which didn't entirely convince me when I read it. But he also talks about the modernist elements of the bionic body implicit in that springs versus leopards imagery of masculinity, which can't survive the. I wasn't quite, as I said, not convinced by this argument.
He's also for the final scene when he's I'm going to run to the Turkish trenches. I'm going to do that. Yeah, when you saw him run, he has actually left his rifle behind, which doesn't seem like a brilliant idea. I mean, he's never going to get the opportunity to use it, but you probably take it with you.
Isn't the point that because they're the third wave, he knows that it's hopeless and he's just going to run? I think that's the whole point, is the futility of it. There's not a great deal of subtlety in some of these films, can we just suggest? Which may be another reason why they're well known.
Are you trying to suggest that it's possible we're reading too much into some of this?
We are academics,
and by we, effectively, I mean me.
No, I think that makes all of us.
I have to. My big query with watching Paths of Glory is going back and trying to figure out how Stanley Kubrick sort of picked a film about a French mutiny to make as his second film. It just struck me as a slightly odd marker to drop in, or it's why I was trying to wrestle with ideas of republicanism and levy en masse, sort of this sort of joint backgrounds between the two republics, and it failed me why he decided to,
because he's Kubrick and he is that obscure. I really don't like Kubrick. Sorry.
But he'd only done The Killing at the time, so it hadn't been a big success. It's a perfectly fine film, and then you come into that, and I thought, well, it's a bit of an odd film, and he chose to do it in black. If you think he's choosing to do this in black and white, by 57, most films will be coming out in colour. It's just an odd. Why that one? Why if you're an up and coming guy, you might want to pick something a bit more pertinent to get you seen, to bring your money in, liked by the critics, but not necessarily the box office, which doesn't always do your career very well if you're not making millions and millions of dollars on people's investments. But then actually something else that struck me was that Kubrick then obviously goes on to make the Vietnam film. And I didn't.
Full Metal Jacket.
Yeah, and I wondered if there was some watching at the time. I thought, I wonder if you could put pins in Kubrick's career that draw back to Paths of Glory, especially with like Full Metal Jacket. Odd career to make 2 war films, is it? John Ford, I guess, made quite a lot of westerns, so perhaps not.
And now we're referencing our own first episode, aren't we?
George Lucas made a lot of Vietnam films, it just didn't look like it. Yay!
So, as we're going full circle, back to Star Wars, do you think it's time we should wrap it up?
I think possibly. Are we going to try and look at 1917 next time?
It's quite tempting, isn't it? The question is, so we've had some people kind of say that they'd like to come and talk about elements of 1917. We still hold out hope that anyone involved with the film will pay us, some kind of modicum of human kindness.
Maybe we have to ask some experts on to talk about elements of it and then publicise it, and hopefully we can convince them that we got it all wrong and they need to come and correct the record.
Yes, and then we make that our live episode.
Yes. I think that sounds like a plan.
So what elements do we have on the cards?
So we got contacted by, I want to say Beth
Wyatt.
Beth Wyatt wants to talk to us about the portrayal of the countryside and landscape in 1917, and that sounds like a lot of fun. We're still hopefully going to do something about computer games. I reckon if we do a computer games episode, and then we could maybe talk about whether or not 1917 is a computer game film in a different episode, that could be fun. But yeah, there's got to be loads of stuff that we can mine out of 1917. He says, doing his best Nivelle impression. In a very weird joke that definitely won't play well with certain sections of the audience.
We know our audience so well.
That's true, yeah.
So with that then, should we call it a day? And I guess we'll hopefully 1917 next time out.
Wrap up three episodes on film with the present would be nice.
Oh, thanks a lot. See you soon.
Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Oh.